Okay. Yep. Great. Let's get started. Welcome, everyone. To learn more about Canada's massive stores of carbon in nature and how they're critical to holding global warming to 1.5 degrees. I'm Mary McDonald, Head of Conservation at WWF Canada. Before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge that we've been joined by some members of Parliament from Canada. First of all, we have the Honourable Stephen Guilbeault, our brand new Minister of Environment and Climate Change. Welcome, Minister. And also Mr. Dan Albus, also a member of Parliament, interested in these issues as well. So thank you for coming. Okay, we're excited to share a new analysis of where land-based carbon is stored in Canada. It's foundational work at the heart of WWF's Canada's 10-year plan called Regenerate Canada. The plan that we launched this year under our Reversible campaign focuses on powerful, measurable actions that drive towards improvements in both climate and biodiversity at the same time. The carbon analysis is the first in a series of technical reports. Also in the works is mapping coastal blue carbon, as well as an assessment of where restoration actions will have the greatest impact in the shortest amount of time. Canada has globally significant amounts of carbon stored in ecosystems, and along with Russia, Canada is home to more than half of the world's intact nature. Thanks to this research, we now have a clear understanding of how much carbon we're talking about. This is carbon that has to be managed properly to avoid accelerating climate change. In the Okay, I'll just wait.
Unless you're seated in a room with a proven distance, while eating or drinking or are medically exempt. Thank you.
Alrighty. Okay, in the context of climate, destruction or disruption of these large carbon stores, some currently under threat from development, will release hundreds of millions of tons of carbon into the atmosphere. It will also remove the ability of peatlands, complex forest ecosystems, and rich organic soils to capture and stabilize carbon. Healthy ecosystems have a strong role to play in reducing emissions, but their contribution must be accurately measured and maintained so that they're truly reducing greenhouse gases. Much of the intact nature throughout Canada is in Indigenous territories as they've cared for it for thousands of years. Our recommendations for action emphasize the imperative of Indigenous rights, knowledge, and governance structures as core operating principles. We couldn't do this work alone. Our colleagues at McMaster University and other researchers developed the methodology and helped us with analysis. And so we all know technical findings are a wonderful thing, but they need to be translated into action on the ground. And so today we'll also learn about some real-world examples of that. Okay, over to the panel. We have a great panel to speak to different parts of this work. First, we'll hear from James Snyder, the VP of Science, Knowledge, and Innovation at WWF Canada. James will be followed by Dr. Alamu Gonzamo from McMaster University, who's also Canada Research Chair for Remote Sensing and Terrestrial Ecosystems. Then we'll hear from two Indigenous colleagues who will both join virtually. They're both leading extraordinary work on carbon in nature, for which this analysis is useful. We welcome Vern Chichu, Director of Lands and Resources, Mushkegowuk Council, and Mushkegowuk territories stretch across what's also known as Hudson's Bay, James Bay lowlands. And we'll hear from Angela Kane, CEO of Secwepemcúlecw Restoration and Stewardship Society. Secwepemc territories are located in what's also known as interior British Columbia. Alrighty, James, can you please walk us through the findings?
Great. Thanks so much for that introduction, Mary, and thank you for all joining us here today in person and online for the release of these results 2 years in the making. Ultimately, we found 405 petagrams of carbon. That's 405 billion tons of carbon stored in terrestrial ecosystems across the country. That's the equivalent of 30 years of global emissions found in our forests, our grasslands, our wetlands, and especially our peatlands. The importance of soils, and especially peatlands in Canada, is staggering. Let me speak a little bit about why we did this work. Back in 2019, WF Canada released our Wildlife Protection Assessment. That was a gap analysis of protected areas in Canada. We looked to see how are we faring towards, in our CBD goal, IACHI Target 11, or in Canada, the pathway to Target 1, 17% protection, and are we protecting the right places? Those places have the greatest importance for biodiversity, including species at risk, as well as carbon storage. And what we found in that analysis, amongst other things, is that carbon storage in Canada, in terms of the publicly available information at that time, was incomplete or out of date. So we started a multi-year research effort alongside McMaster University to bring together the first Canada-wide assessment of ecosystem carbon. We're releasing that today, 250-meter resolution map of ecosystem carbon across the country. Ultimately, what we've done here for the first time is got an estimate of the value of carbon storage, the carbon pool, the carbon reserve in our terrestrial ecological systems. This does not yet include coastal blue carbon, does not include our blue ecosystems, but it does look at our terrestrial ecosystems and what we've found there. The numbers, as I said, are staggering. First, let's look at the national results. So 405 petagrams, 405 billion tons of carbon. And this is an infographic of the pools of carbon. 21 petagrams in our above ground biomass and vegetation, our forests and our grasslands, the roots and biomass of those systems. The number that hits home to me, of course, is the importance of our soils. 384 petagrams, more than 90% of the carbon stored in Canada is found below the ground in our soils, in our peatlands. And that's only up to 1 meter depth. As we begin to go deeper, that number only increases. We now know that we have this huge responsibility to steward and protect this important carbon store and to avoid the emissions of the carbon storage into the atmosphere that would accelerate future climate change. Looking at the map across the country, we can see important patterns geographically in space in terms of where these ecosystem carbon is stored. The map on your screen on the left side in green is the above ground biomass that found in our vegetation and in our forests. You can see the broad swath of the boreal zone. You can see coastal BC, and of course, right across the country, the importance of vegetation there. But when we look on the map on the right, our soils, those are where the numbers get really quite high, in particular in regions like the Hudson-James Bay lowlands and across the boreal zone. Three regions that we've highlighted, importantly knowing that ecosystem carbon is found across the country. From coast to coast to coast, we have carbon stored in our ecosystems here. There are 3 areas that we've highlighted in our analysis. In the Hudson-James Bay lowlands, that ecozone comes through is number 1 with a bullet in terms of the important carbon storage that's found there. 44 petagrams of carbon, that's 44 billion tons of carbon, found in the Hudson-James Bay ecozone alone. This is a massive amount of carbon. This is carbon that is accumulated over thousands of years through the accumulation of peat up to 15 feet deep in that ecozone. And of course, home to many First Nations and Indigenous communities. Westward, we extend through the boreal zone into Manitoba, and for the first time, we see a major area of extension of this peat ecosystem westward into Manitoba through NWT across the boreal zone and into the Mackenzie Valley. That swath of below ground carbon is, of course, significant. And finally, in the coastal BC region, the large amounts of carbon stored in our forests, our old-growth forests and beyond. One last thing before I pass it over to the McMaster team will tell us more about how we did this analysis is not only are we releasing the analysis and the data products behind it, available open access for anyone to download and use, We are also making an interactive viewer available for anyone. You can pan, you can zoom, you can identify an area of interest, and that can give you an estimate of the total carbon found at 250-meter resolution right across the country, available at wf.ca for anyone who'd be interested to use that tool. Our intent here, certainly as Mary brought forward, is to be moving this tool to bring forward conservation action and importantly to steward that ecosystem carbon, both in terms of climate in Canada, but of course the responsibility that we have on a global stage.
Thanks, James. And we'll go online now to Alamu. Alamu, could you please tell us a little bit about how the analysis was done?
Thank you very much, Mary, and thanks, James, for the nice introduction. We started this work 2 years ago when WWF Canada contacted me and asked me how much do we know about Canada's biomass and soil carbon content. My answer was we don't know enough. The main reason being Canada's land ecosystem is huge, difficult to access. So we have only a limited coverage by ground measurements. And ground measurements are difficult to collect and expensive, but they are very, very important. So 2 years ago, we started compiling all freely available ground measurements of biomass and soil carbon content data. For above ground biomass, we compiled field measurements that were collected within 5 years. In total, we compiled field biomass data from 42,000 plots across Canada. For soil carbon content, we also compiled data that were collected close to from 7,000 sites. So these ground measurements are used as a reference data to train a model that would eventually provide a spatially continuous map for the entire country. We selected a machine learning algorithm called a random forest that relies on a huge amount of soil and plant data. We use different sets of satellite data for this to train this model. For instance, for plant to estimate plant biomass data or biomass carbon content, we prioritize the use of structural variables extracted from, for example, synthetic aperture radar, and also satellite-based LiDAR, that is a laser scanning technology from space. That's one of the latest advancement in land remote sensing. We also compiled topographic data and the long-term average of climate data, and we extracted also seasonality signal from different satellite data. So in total, we compiled 78 data layers for above ground biomass prediction and 40 data layers for soil content estimation, because we think these data sets can explain the amount of carbon both in plant biomass and soil inside the soil. We then ran a simple correlation analysis to remove some of the redundant data layers so that our model is not overfitted. The reference ground measurement and the satellite data then were fed into a machine learning model to train the model. The model then learns the relationship between the carbon content, that's from measurement, and different satellite observations. After training, we ran the model for entire Canada to produce a spatially continuous maps of biomass and soil carbon content. To estimate soil carbon content, we train and run the model in 2 steps in order to maximize the use of all available ground measurements. In the first step, we estimate the organic carbon concentration, that is a gram of carbon per kilogram of soil. And the second step, then we estimate a bulk density, that's the amount of soil in a given volume of space. So by combining these 2 estimations, then we get total soil carbon content for that is measured in kilogram per meter square area. We also estimate uncertainty for both soil and biomass carbon content, uncertainty related to the modeling approach, also uncertainty related to satellite input data with a 90% probability of the likely range of values. So the biomass and soil carbon maps are produced at 250-meter spatial resolution. We predicted 4 different classes of biomass carbon content. The first one is above ground biomass of forest trees. The second one is below ground biomass of forest trees. And third one is biomass of dead plant materials in a tree ecosystem in forest. And finally, we have a biomass of non-forest ecosystems. So the maps will be updated in the future because we are planning to collect more ground measurements, particularly from peatlands. And so we will produce a new version of maps with version control. We are also currently using this data as a benchmark to understand the vulnerability of the carbon stock to climate change and disturbance, such as carbon removal by decomposition, fires, harvests, and other types of disturbance up until year of 2300, because Canada has a lot of deep soil carbon. Thank you very much. I will pass it on from here.
Thank you, Alamu. We're going to go back online again to talk to Vern. Hi, Vern. Oops. All right, okay. Could you please let us know how the lands and waters of the Hudson's James Bay lowlands are important to the Mushkegowuk nations, and any changes that you may have seen over the last couple of decades? Okay.
Thank you, Mary and James and Alamo. Glad to be here, glad to participate. Wajem Eswe Demek, in my Cree language, to say greetings to all my friends and relatives, as we are all related, through our waters that join us throughout the globe. A very important connection, and it's important for us in our region, the relationship we have with the lands and waters, and because we've lived here for millennia, and it has provided us the food that we gather, the fish, etc., for millennia, for our people. It sustained us for all this time. We respect that relationship with the lands and waters and understand it very clearly. As we are part of the cycle of life, we are not superior to it or separate from it. We are part of it. And what we do to it is, what we do to ourselves. And in the last, few decades, 30, 40 years, since I was a little boy growing up in the community of Moose Factory on the Moose River, which is about 15 miles to the mouth of the southern tip of James Bay. And we used to see tens of thousands of snow geese, blue geese, wavies as we call them. It was an exciting time of the year for us as we prepared to go out there and hunt geese as one of our main staples for our people. And today, when you go out to this region, it's eerie, very quiet, because there's no more geese around. They've all disappeared since, and this activity no longer happens in the fall because the geese have gone elsewhere. And so there's impacts to the region, that we know that we faced over these years. We're experiencing more winter rains. We have a winter road system that feeds the communities north who are otherwise isolated. And because of the winter rains and the early thaw and the warming temperatures, the season for the winter road system is shortened. and therefore making it difficult, for the communities to receive their supplies, and and so it's difficult on food security as well, because the depletion of the birds, mainly, the geese that come to this region are no longer there, so it's difficult. But the short season of the winter road also, drives up the cost of living, which is difficult for the people that depend on food from the store, store bought food, which is very expensive because goods have to be flown in, and that cost goes way up, and so it's difficult for the people to maintain, their lifestyles, because it's expensive to get out to the land as well, because things have changed. The early thaw, the weather is unpredictable. The melting of the ice and the freezing of the ice is different. People used to be able to read, the ice and the snow, and know how to travel through this region to get to their hunting areas. Now they're having to use helicopters to take them out to these regions, and not everybody can afford a helicopter to get out onto the land to gather the foods. So food security is a big issue in our region right now. And but it's also, we know that we contribute very little to climate change, and but yet, we're seeing, that we are being most impacted by this, and we are calling out there, to say, that there needs to be something that takes place, because something is happening outside of our region that's impacting on the territory, and impacting on our traditional way of life. Not to mention, the region is a significant region in terms of its ecosystem. It's the largest wetlands in North America, the largest carbon sink in North America, second largest in the world, as you've heard. And and they say that if the northern boreal across the landscapes of Canada is the king of carbon, then its crown jewel is the Hudson James Bay lowlands. And this region our elders call the breathing lands of Mother Earth. So it's a sacred place. It's a sacred, that to us, but not only to us, but to everybody. I think globally, that we should be looking at this region and conserving it and protecting to the best of our ability, and so we did put out a call, to ask for help, in terms of how this region can be protected. And working with WWF Canada, is one of those projects, and NGOs that have come forward to help us in terms of bringing attention to this region and its importance and its significance, like I said, not only to us, but to the whole world for what it does. And the depletion of the peatlands, depletion of the wetlands, and the impacts that could potentially happen, could make this region an emitter of greenhouse gases if we're not careful. And we're seeing that now. Those impacts are happening within the land. The permafrost is melting. There's sinkholes in the region, the large areas of land that has fallen because of the thawing of permafrost. And there's dried up ponds that dot the region. You could see that there's no water in these ponds, and that's been happening. And we know that this region is provides services in the neighborhood of, if you put a value to it, according to research, it's $700 billion per year. Regulating climate, recharging aquifers, absorbing and filtering contaminants, and so on. And so it's a very important region. I think that this work that we're doing with WWF will help in bringing, the attention to this region and how we go forward, and how we begin to look at strategies, to help with protecting and conserving this region and bringing it to the world stage, and having our governments and people across the world to help us, to bring some kind of help to us to protect and conserve this region. Thank you.
Thank you, Vern. Thanks for sharing that. Okay, James, we're going to come back to you here. Maybe you could talk to us about the recommendations that we're making based on the findings of this analysis.
Great. Thank you for that, Mary, and thank you, Vern, for those words on the significance, both nationally and internationally, of the Hudson-James Bay lowlands and the Mushkegowuk territory. The recommendations that we're bringing forward today, in many ways, are gained in part from the experiences that we've had working along the Mushkegowuk Council and other Indigenous partners across the country. The recommendations that we bring here really come first and foremost with the perspective of avoiding the emission from the conversion and degradation of important carbon storage areas. Of course, recognizing that these carbon storage areas are found on Indigenous territories from coast to coast to coast. That as we move to protect and conserve those carbon storage areas, that we do so in a way that it advances and empowers Indigenous peoples, their knowledge systems, their culture, and their rights. There's a number of recommendations that I will speak to. Try that again. Yeah, I think that's better. Okay. The recommendations that we bring forward here, thank you, are mechanisms of how do we avoid that conversion and protection of important carbon storage areas. One, of course, is the role of protecting and conserved areas, and especially Indigenous protected and conserved areas. Of course, Canada has committed to 25% protection by 2025, member of a high ambition coalition protection by 30% by 2030. That is a critical pathway in terms of protecting the right places. These are ambitious goals, but we need to do so in the right way. That is an opportunity, if not a responsibility, to do so and how to demonstrate on a global stage. The second, perhaps critical mechanism, is the role of the environmental assessment process in terms of the environmental assessment for permitting and approvals of proposed projects. We did recognize through the role of the strategic assessment of climate change that the full footprint impact of the carbon footprint of a proposed project ought to be considered in the environmental assessment process, including from the land sector. We brought forward the recommendation, of course, that all levels of government need to include the footprint and emissions of proposed development from the land sector, especially from these stored carbon areas. That needs to be explicitly considered as we move forward in the permitting and approval of projects to understand whether or not we can achieve a 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway net zero future as part of Canada's national carbon budget. Third, we do have to recognize that protection and conservation are not the only mechanisms that we can ensure these carbon storage areas persist into the future. Active management of those carbon stores is critical to ensure not only that they continue to store, continue to absorb carbon, but actually sequester more from the atmosphere. Not just the carbon pool, not just the carbon reserve, but an active source of carbon sequestration, removing carbon from the atmosphere and drawing it down into our ecosystems, into our wetlands, into our forests, into our coastal blue carbon zones as well. Recommendation number 2, of course, is the recognition of the important role of guardians. We've seen great progress in Canada and around the world in terms of Indigenous guardians, monitoring and stewarding Indigenous territories. We're calling for additional investment in guardians programs, especially the lens of carbon guardians. We've seen, of course, important work done on freshwater, monitoring water quality, biodiversity and wildlife, and now carbon is an increasingly important value. So where those Indigenous peoples are interested and want to work on carbon monitoring and measurement, that's certainly something that we're calling for additional investments in. Okay. Two remaining recommendations here that we'd like to bring to your attention, recommendations for action now that we know where these carbon storage areas are and how much is stored in Canada's terrestrial ecological systems. The third, of course, is, excuse me, just looking here, keeping track of things, the financial mechanisms, both market and non-market mechanisms that bring direct investment, especially into Indigenous communities, to incentivize future stewardship and conservation of these places. WF Canada is at the early stages of bringing together a roundtable discussion to figure out what are those new mechanisms that can bring livelihood and well-being to local and Indigenous communities. Fourth, and this is looking at the stage today in terms of what we're speaking about, is our targets, both in terms of the role of our nationally determined contributions. Canada bring forward an updated nationally determined contribution this past summer that officially recognized the role of nature-based climate solutions. We would like to see a specific target in terms of avoided emissions, the role of nature-based climate solutions, and of our protected areas in our emissions targets moving forward. In addition to that, we need to improve our reporting through the National Inventory of Reports, the NIRs, to better account for ecosystem carbons, our emissions and removals from the terrestrial carbon systems, and especially our peatlands. Monitoring and reporting on emissions from our vast carbon storage areas, those peatlands, is absolutely critical in an area that across the board is perhaps underserved in terms of where things are right now in the NIRs. Okay, with that, I'm passing things back to Mary.
Hi, I'm going to ask a couple of questions of Angie. The work that Angie that you're leading in the Subwepama territories is based on an amazing vision of returning 150,000 square kilometers to pre-colonial conditions based on Indigenous knowledge with some Western science woven in. It is an outstanding undertaking in the Subwepama lands. It's also an area of important carbon storage. So Angie, you are working on monitoring and measuring carbon. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, sure. Good morning, and thank you, Mary and James, for having me speak today. This past 6 years, we've really seen a change in our forests due to climate change, and decades of mismanaged forests have led to extreme fuel loads within our forests. And in 2017, we saw, like you say, 192,000 hectares of shared traditional territory of 8 First Nations communities, where we've been enduring loss of life. We did endure a loss of life, as well as our wildlife, our medicines, our source of food. And these wildfires had created major ground disturbances like landslides and spring flooding, which have destroyed our critical salmon habitat, and not to mention future economic opportunities. We've currently been working on a BC salmon rehabilitation project where we're rehabilitating about 80 kilometers of streams for critical salmon habitat. And during this project, we were approached by WWF in regards to how they could help us support some of the work that we're wanting to do, because we've also expanded out and looking at our concerns around the carbon sequestration from the lands that have been burnt. And we developed a training video and materials for performing biomass and soil carbon field sampling. And through that, we also tested in that area, in the burnt out area, we identified burnt areas as well as unburnt areas to identify what the loss of soil and above ground biomass carbon would be. So we checked into lying dead woods, vegetation, soil, also checked for ecological, cultural, and archaeological values, which are extremely important to our First Nations communities. our next steps with this process is to start sharing the sampling and field protocols with other First Nations communities so that we can build their capacity.
Angie, can you give us a sense of what some additional resources might do to help you?
You know, it would help us secure and increase some sampling areas that we need to look at for building a baseline within our areas. It would also provide us more opportunities to look at different planting regimes for a higher survival rate in reforestation. This past summer, we once again saw our forest devastated by wildfires and heat domes, where we were seeing temperatures up to plus 45 and plus 48. In some cases, it was, I think, up to 55 degrees. These are creating areas where survival of seedlings and plants is just not sustainable. More funding would also provide us an opportunity to continue developing new and innovative technology to support our on-ground work. And as well as we're looking at economic opportunities for carbon sequestration projects that will generate carbon credits for significant Indigenous revenue sources. And this revenue source would then be used to purchase forest tenures back, where First Nations can reestablish forests and stewardship practices from an Indigenous perspective.
And Angie, can you speak to traditional Indigenous approaches to land and fire management and what that means for the Restoration and Stewardship Society?
Well, like I said, over the past 6 years, we have seen some mega fires, and sadly, our forests are being devastated. The only positive side to this is that in these areas, we now have what we call a clean slate. And so we have an opportunity to incorporate a really holistic approach to our forests through traditional knowledge. Look at replanting back more of a deciduous, like aspen, cottonwood, and birch. These plants are also natural fire breaks, but when harvested by licensees, they take these trees out, these species out, and thus create, and they also, for future forest practices, use pesticide on these trees, which then, you know, kills the trees, and they're looking more at the forest for an economic value and not as a healthy ecosystem. So, you know, along with establishing back deciduous trees, along with pine and fir for, you know, a more balanced forest that provides not only an economic opportunity, but a healthy functioning ecosystem. And so we do this by utilizing traditional cultural burning during the late fall and early spring, which helps keeps that fuel management under control so that our future, we won't see these mega fires that we're accounting now. Traditional knowledge, putting back into our forests is extremely important for our First Nations communities. It's our forest is looked at as a, like I said, in a holistic way. It's our cultural traditions. It's our connection to, you know, our past way of living, and we're seeing this devastated by our fires, and we really need to take a more holistic and a more healthier look at forest management and go back to more of the traditional ways of doing this.
Okay. Angie, thank you so much. That was really interesting and helpful to hear about. We're going to go back to you, Vern, now, a couple of questions. In the Mushkegowuk lands, you're also doing monitoring and measuring, and so could you talk to us a little bit about that, and also that question about what additional resources might do to help you with that?
Yes, thank you. We are working, you know, with WWF on the carbon mapping project. And the work that we're doing is, you know, going to put this region on the map nationally and brought internationally, you know, in terms of what what this area holds in terms of carbon. And so the work that we're doing, to create a team of people from the communities to do the sampling, to assist Alamo and the Camille, I believe, and from McMaster's and WWF, the training that we're doing with these individuals to show them how to do sampling and things like that. Is we want to be able to create a team, create that capacity to be able to go out onto the land and use their experience as well on the land and how to get to these regions that we need to in collecting these peat samples for this project. And so further assistance, would be very helpful in creating this team and being able to continue when we start looking at monitoring, and how we continue to keep an eye on the carbon, and in this region, and ensure that it continues to do what it's supposed to do, and to monitor that. And so we're happy to be part of that project. Thank you.
And just one more question for you, Vern. We know the government has started a regional assessment, a strategic assessment. Why have the Mushkegowuk chiefs called for a moratorium on development in your region?
Yes, the not only climate change is a threat to this region, but there's a potential development site just west of us at the top of the watersheds that is called the Ring of Fire region. And it's said to be about 100, 100 kilometers in diameter. And it looks to be about 150 to 200 years of mining is what's projected for this region. It's a huge find for chromite, the mineral chromite. There's gold, there's copper, zinc, and all these other minerals that that Ontario is pushing to get this region open. There's road projects that are happening that will connect the Highway 11 corridor to this region, crossing the major rivers along the James and Hudson Bay lowlands that we feel will be impacted downstream from this region, because this region is uphill from where we are. And if anything should happen in that region, the cumulative impacts will happen in our region downstream, but also down Muskeg, because the streams run underneath the wetlands that feed the waters and eventually feed the James Bay. And so we called on a moratorium, for the work to be halted until there's a proper protection and conservation plan in place for the region. It's very important, as potential impacts could include, the disturbance of peatlands, and disturbance of peatlands could cause, a disruption in terms of the carbon that this region collects on behalf of everybody. So, so this, the chiefs had called for that moratorium. There's a regional assessment that's been called on by the federal government, and we've asked for participation in this regional assessment through co-governance, nation-to-nation recognition, to no avail. And so the regional assessment will go forward, but they will put together a committee of people that will hear our concerns and other stakeholders and other First Nations in the region. And again, we are not part of the process. We are on the outside, kind of looking in, sitting on the outside of the table, on the other side of the table, instead of being part of that table and making decisions on what happens in our territories. But not only that, to bring attention to the region, for its importance and significance. We're calling on the governments, of Ontario and Canada, to really look at this region and to ensure, that there's conservation and protection for the wetlands, for what it does, and for the carbon storage, the mine site will sit right within the peatlands, and there's a potential of large areas of peatlands being disturbed by this development. So, we've called for that moratorium, basically, to have a really good look at this before anything should take place upstream from this large carbon sink and huge wetlands in our region. Thank you.
Thanks, Vern. And I think that's the main part of our panel discussion today. I want to close our program. I want to call on, as I said, our new Environment and Climate Change Minister, the Honorable Stephen Guilbeault, to say a few remarks. So, Minister, over to you. And
you want us to change, please?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mary. So my name is Stephen Guilbeault, and when she says new Minister of the Environment and Climate Change, she means brand new. Today's day 15 for me on the job, but great pleasure and an honor to be here. For many reasons, one of them being that my ministry, Environment and Climate Change Canada, has had a long relationship of working with the World Wildlife Fund on conservation issues in Canada, and I think it's a relationship that underscores our mutual appreciation for the beauty of nature, and for what it does for humans and for the ecospheres. I have this speech, which I won't read, but there are elements that I would like to go through. Many of them have been mentioned. I think, if we're honest with each other, Canada has some catch-up to do when it comes to conservation. Things have been improving over the last few years. We've made record-level investment in conservation, both in budget 2019 and budget 2021. There was a time where, as an environmentalist, I was part of the Green Budget Coalition, and every year we would go and see the government and make recommendations on conservation issues, on toxics, on climate change, and we felt bold about asking for hundreds of millions of dollars for conservation, or hundreds of millions of dollars for home energy retrofit. And now the government of Canada is investing billions of dollars in conservation and tens of billions of dollars to transform not only our energy system, but our entire economy and our society to a low carbon society. It's a huge challenge for a company like us on many different fronts. We are still a natural based economy. When it comes to oil and gas, we've heard about mining. We could talk about forestry, and how do we change that dynamic, or those dynamic, is something that we've been working hard on over the past few years. I've come to many COPs before. It's the first time that I'm a COP as a minister. My first COP was the first COP in 1995. Young activist, long hair, long beard, blockading the doors of the meeting hall, telling delegates like myself that their job wasn't done and they needed to do better. And I think we have to continue doing better. And one of the most amazing things about COP26 is that for the first time ever, we've stopped talking about climate change and the protection of the biodiversity as if they're two separate things. As if the atmosphere and the biosphere doesn't see the linkages between them. And that gives me great hope. As some people have said, it might have been you, James, Canada has signed on to the High Ambition Coalition, which means that we want to protect 30% of Canada's lands and oceans by 2030. And we've also set a goal for 25% by 25. And so I've been minister for 15 days, and there's rarely a day that goes by without someone on the team that's telling me this is going to be difficult to get to 25 by 25, to get to 30 by 30. Harvey's in the back saying, no problem, Stephen, piece of cake. And I love his, obviously, many things about Harvey, including his optimism. But we are dedicated to doing this, and it's not perfect, far from it. And one of the most significant thing I think that has changed in Canada, certainly when thinking about conservation, but also about many other things, is how now Indigenous people are front and center. There's no conservation project that can go ahead in Canada anymore without their involvement. And in many cases, these projects are Indigenous led. And there's a number of projects that I could quote where we've done that. I think we've taken another step in the right direction this week as part of our climate finance package. In the lead up to Glasgow, Canada doubled its climate finance pledge from 2.3 to $5.3 billion. And I announced earlier last week that 20% of that, so roughly a little more than $1 billion, will go for adaptation for climate finance projects that have biodiversity benefits. It's the first time that Canada makes such a pledge. We're not the only ones. Certainly a number of other major donor countries have done that as well. But I believe it is one of the ways where we are starting to work on silos when it comes to climate and biodiversity. So perhaps one more thing before I close. Earlier this week, I've also announced $460 million over 5 years to protect and expand 22 of Canada's national wildlife areas, create 10 new national parks, and 4 new freshwater marine conservation areas that we want to complete our existing national parks. One of the things I've certainly observed, and it may be the case for you as well during the pandemic, is how certainly in urban, but also not just in urban areas, how people were looking for their green spaces. It was basically the only place we could go. Everything else was off limits. And that's, during the last election, that's certainly a message that we've heard loud and clear from Canadians, both in terms of climate action, and what Canadians have told us is they wanted us to do more and do it faster. And perhaps the fact that an ex-environmental activist is all of a sudden environment and climate change minister has something to do with that. But also on conservation. This is also another message that has come very clear to us. And I mean, I was hearing Vern earlier about some of the projects that are happening in the area of Ring and Fire. And Vern, we should talk, because I've had a first briefing on this project by our impact assessment agency. And my understanding was that there was still a dialogue happening as to how we would go about doing that. But clearly you have a different point of view, so I'd really like to have your views and those of your communities on that. But we view our continued efforts on reconciliation as making sure that these activities that are done on the lands of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit are done with them, with their collaboration, with a seat at the table for them, and as I said earlier, in many cases, by them leading the way. I look forward to following the progress that you're doing with these projects, and I thank you for all your work, and it's a real pleasure for me to have been here today. Merci beaucoup.
I'll just finish up here to say thank you for joining us, Minister. Thank you so much. And also for your leadership at COP, and particularly the actions that are linking climate and biodiversity is like so helpful. So thank you so much. And I think that's it for us today. These are the speakers' contact information for anybody that wants to follow up, maybe take a picture or something. So thank you for coming. Okay, thank you. Bye.